Good morning, everyone. Thanks all for joining. You're all already gone quiet ahead of time in anticipation. So thanks for joining us this morning. I know it's a busy first Monday morning of these sessions, and everyone's still navigating their way through. So it's really nice to see you all here. And part of the reason why we're all here in Bonn is for the final technical phase of the Global Stocktake, with the third technical dialogue kicking off tomorrow. And we've seen through these submissions and dialogues that the Global Stocktake has already delivered really a wealth of information about collective progress made towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. And with that, it's clear to us all that we are not yet on track. So the Global Stocktake now needs to synthesize that information in detail about current progress, but also needs to now look at the how. So what is the way forward to enhancing meaningful, immediate action? And that's certainly something that the co-facilitators are aiming to do during the current sessions this week. Many have proposed, and I think it's quite widely discussed, that to make this information about the how and where we're going more accessible while remaining relevant and actionable, we can organize the discourse and the discussions around systems. And that's the perspective that we would like to look at in more detail today. A systems perspective respects the GST mandate of assessing collective progress across all the elements of mitigation, adaptation, and cross-cutting issues, while also facilitating a more detailed discussion around the more concrete and tangible issues that we want to get at. It also allows us to establish a vision of what a 1.5 compatible world would look like, and the deep systemic changes required to achieve that vision. And with that, we think can more concretely use that vision in the assisting to update the 2030 targets. So again, being more concrete, identifying where there is need and also the opportunities to accelerate change. So today, we'd like to share with you some analysis from two quite big projects that take this systems perspective into the Global Stocktake, and we hope can help to inform the Global Stocktake going forward. For this analysis, we identify what's needed across multiple systems in terms of defining system-specific targets compatible with 1.5 degrees. We've been tracking progress towards those targets, but then also identifying the levers that can initiate and accelerate change. The two projects we'd like to present today are those up on the screen. It's the Systems Change Lab and an EU-funded project, NDC Aspects. Under the Systems Change Lab, NewClimate Institute, Climate Analytics, and World Resources Institute, along with other partners, have been establishing systems roadmaps and tracking the progress towards these 1.5 compatible targets. Today, we'll look at 7 systems: power, industry, buildings, transport, agriculture and food, land, and underpinning those systems, the finance changes that need to happen. On the Systems Change Lab as well, you will see additional systems that we are also covering. The second project we'll look at, Lukas Hermwille and Sebastian Oberthür, with me up here, will take us through their analysis on the NDC Aspects project, where they've been diving a bit deeper on 4 of these systems and looking at opportunities for enhanced international cooperation to actually deliver on the progress. And more specifically, we'll look at what the role the Global Stocktake can have in helping to drive and facilitate that progress on international cooperation. We do want to acknowledge up front that both of these projects really focus on mitigation and do not cover all aspects of the Global Stocktake. The targets and transformations we propose for reducing emissions in these systems do need to be achieved fairly and justly, and in a manner that makes these systems more resilient to the increasing impacts of climate change. And we think that an equally in-depth analysis for adaptation and other cross-cutting issues would be really highly valuable. However, we do, as far as we can, try to take into account some of these other aspects, most specifically those on finance and international cooperation. And of course, also looking at making sure that the targets we're setting are compatible and support development goals and equity goals as well. Just as a point of practicality, we will show 2 presentations, and following that, we are lucky to have hopefully 3, maybe 1 or 2 negotiators joining afterwards to share some reflections and give us some insights into how they think we can use these systems perspectives and information going forward. Just to give your anticipation for the remaining of the event. But first, I'd like to hand over to some fantastic colleagues from the Systems Change Lab. Claire Fyson from Climate Analytics, sitting here on my left, Judit Hecke from NewClimate Institute, and Sophie Boehm from World Resources Institute. All three of them are lead authors on the State of Climate Action report and contributors to the System Change Lab project as a whole. Claire, would you like us to kick us off with some insights on the Systems Change Lab?
Great, thank you, Louise. So as Louise said, today we're presenting some analysis that you can find on the Systems Change Lab website and our accompanying State of Climate Action report. The background being that it's over 7 years since the Paris Agreement and emissions are continuing to climb. And unfortunately, we've used up so much of the global carbon budget that we no longer have space to really only focus on the low-cost options first. We need to transform nearly all systems, from how we power our homes to how we grow our food. And in the State of Climate Action report, we take a look at what it would take to transform these systems in a way that would be compatible with the Paris Agreement. Essentially, what we do is we take the emissions gap in 2030 and we translate that into what needs to happen across these different sectors on the ground. And that's really useful for the Global Stocktake, as it gives us some concrete elements, some concrete targets to aim for, and some concrete recommendations for governments to take forward so that we can really look to close that gap in this critical decade. So today we'll share our insights on 7 energy, food, land, and finance systems, which collectively emit around 85% of global greenhouse gas emissions, as you can see in this figure. And within these systems, we've identified 40 indicators for which we've developed 1.5 compatible targets for 2030 and 2050. To establish these, we ask questions like, how quickly would we need to phase out coal in order to be consistent with 1.5 degrees? Or how quickly do we need to halt peatland degradation, for example? And then we compare recent rates of change in each of these indicators with these targets to see which are on track. So in green there, it's fairly self-explanatory. Which are off track or well off track, meaning that recent rates of change are not enough to get us to meet those 2030 targets. In the case of well off track targets, that means they'd need to accelerate more than 2 times or more. And then those that are heading in completely the wrong direction and would need to do a U-turn. And we also highlight those where there is not enough data at the moment to tell what's needed. We also identify where it's likely that change might not be linear. So for example, if an indicator is really linked to technology adoption and we could see really rapid nonlinear change, then we take note of where that could happen and we factor that into our methods. The headline finding, unfortunately, is that while there are some bright spots, for example, in the development of low-carbon energy, renewable energy, and electric vehicles, the hard truth is that none of the 40 indicators that we track are on track to achieve the 2030 targets that we've developed. And where we can make comparisons with last year's report, in most cases, we're actually seeing a worsening trend, with just one exception, which is ruminant meat productivity, for all those agriculture nerds out there. So more specifically, you can see none are on track. 6 indicators are off track. 21 indicators are well off track, so we'd really need to see a lot of change in the pace that they're moving. And 5 are headed in completely the wrong direction. And then a further 8, we don't have enough data to categorize. I'm going to start by talking quickly through the, sorry, missed a slide. No, go forward. Forgot about this one. We also, given that we're so far off track, we also take a look at enablers for getting us on track. So some key conditions that need to change in each of these systems: from innovation, leadership from change agents, regulations and incentives, strong institutions, and behavioral change. And you'll see this peppered through our presentations of examples in each of these systems of what these need to look like. So we're going to start out with the energy system, and I'll start with the power sector before Judit will take us through the end-use sectors, and then we'll move on to the, Sophie will take us through food and land before coming back to me and finance. So the power system, in many ways the most advanced of the systems in terms of the progress made in decarbonisation so far. That's largely due to decades of public and private investment and research and development, which has seen rapidly declining costs in renewables and batteries. Yeah, we're seeing capacity additions in solar and wind, for example, that are breaking records. So there's a lot of positive news here. What does a roadmap look like for the power sector to be 1.5 compatible? Well, critically, we need to see the phase out of coal and fossil gas. Coal needs to be phased out by 2030 in high-income countries, in 2040 in the rest of the world, and fossil gas very closely behind in the early 2040s. We need to also, at the same time, rapidly scale up zero-carbon electricity, of course, not just to replace that fossil fuel generation, but to meet growing demand in electricity generation as we electrify our end-use sectors. And in order to accommodate more renewables in our systems, we need to modernize our power grids. We need to make sure they reach more people. We need to make sure they're more flexible and introduce, for example, demand-side management and storage, and we need to do all of this while ensuring a just transition and equitable access to electricity. Yeah, so you can see here the indicators that we track in this sector. We're not doing so well. There is the off track is the best of the lot in the uptake of zero carbon sources, but as you can see, coal and gas are not moving quickly enough. Gas is actually going in the wrong direction. And while the energy crisis has seen a lot of parts of the world start to reduce their fossil gas consumption, I think with the exception of mainly the US, we do still see higher gas emissions this year than in 2019. So we're definitely not moving in the right direction there. What do we need to do to change this? Well, there's a lot here. I won't go through it all in detail. We need more research and development in the technologies. We've developed a lot already, but for example, grid-scale batteries and other forms of storage. And we definitely, in a lot of cases, need to expand our transmission and distribution systems. Reforming energy markets is a really key one. There are still many cases where markets and regulations haven't kept track with the changes that we're seeing in the power system, which can block the transition. So, for example, there are some markets where they still guarantee hours for fossil fuel plants, meaning that when there's excess generation, zero carbon sources end up being curtailed. So things like that need to be changed. We also need to develop markets that really incentivize renewable uptake. So for example, through carbon pricing and the removal of fossil fuel subsidies so that the true costs of fossil fuels are adequately factored in. We need to see simplified permitting processes, so regulations that really stop blocking the progress in renewables. At the moment, it's the case in many countries that renewable projects take far too many years to be developed because of difficult permitting processes. Other environmental regulations, for example, air quality regulations can be really valuable. For example, in North America and the EU, we've seen good progress in coal phase out due to air quality regulations. And of course, we need to tackle vested interests that are currently perpetuating an outdated and very dangerous power system at the moment. Maybe going on to the next slide in the interest of time. One of the most positive stories that we've seen in our analysis across systems is this rapid growth in wind and solar that you can see charted here, along with various milestones along that trajectory, starting in 2000 when Germany established renewable energy legislation, moving into the late 2000s when the US and China made big stimulus investments in renewables, and then heading through 2015, for example, when solar PV became competitive with new fossil fuel power generation. And you can see it's just continued to take off from there. At this point, the ratio of investment in renewables compared to fossil fuels in the power sector is 4, so 4 times more investments are spent on renewables than in fossil fuels, which is promising. And in 2023, the IEA has estimated that we're going to install 440 gigawatts of new renewable capacity. That's 100 gigawatts more than last year. So that's really promising. What's driving this? Well, over 40 countries have regulatory frameworks for renewables, up from just 1 in 2010. Over 50 countries have tax credits for renewables, and over 170 countries have renewable targets. So there is growing momentum. Also increasing investments in battery storage has risen from 1.6 billion in 2015 to 18 billion in 2022. In the State of Climate Action report, we've got a really promising example from South Australia that I would encourage you to take a look at, of a really nice example where a number of different enabling conditions all came together, including the government set really strong targets that they ramped up over time as they realized that more was achievable. They created certainty for investors by providing financial subsidies. They streamlined planning regulations. They developed adequate transmission infrastructure so that rural areas could develop more renewables, and they adopted grid-scale batteries very early on. And all of this led to them being able to phase out coal from 35% in 2010 down to 0 in 2016. And renewables now make up 65% of generation, and they plan to go far beyond 100% over the next few decades so that they can export power. So that's a really nice example of this build-out. But there are blockages in many countries. For example, poorly designed markets, high costs of capital, lack of capacity, which still need to be addressed. So I will now pass over to Judit to go through the other energy end-use sectors.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, and just to follow up on that, so decarbonizing the power sector is also incredibly important because it has direct impact on the decarbonization efforts of other end-use sectors, in particular the decarbonization of buildings, industry, and transport. For those, electrification is one of the key measures, and this is, of course, much more effective when the power sector is of zero-carbon electricity. However, more substantial transformational change needs to happen to our energy systems. And we have clustered them here again in a sort of roadmap and different shifts, which are all generally follow this avoid, shift, improve framework. So just to point out a couple of them, so in the sense of avoid, we need to, for example, reduce the demand for cement and steel and plastics, or reduce avoidable vehicle and air travel. Then we have to shift to, for example, public and shared and non-motorized transport. And we also have to improve energy efficiency, for example, industrial energy efficiency for industry, but also optimize buildings' energy use. I would like to jump a bit more into detail with all of these sectors. So buildings is where the use of electricity is already very dominant, mainly for cooking, lighting, appliances, cooling, and heating. And this together accounts for 2/3 of all the emissions in the building sector. And the other third comes mainly from burning fossil fuels for cooking and heating, which could also be avoided by electrification. Tracking change in the building sector is, however, quite challenging due to a lack of data, as you can see here. So we were only able to actually calculate the acceleration factor for one of our indicators, which is the energy intensity of buildings operations, and it is well off track, which basically means that the amount of energy per square meter can be significantly improved. Although it is going into the right direction, progress has slowed down in the past couple of years, mainly due to increases in electricity use for electronic devices, cooking, and also cooling. To get back on track, some key measures include better insulation, which would then minimize the need for active heating and cooling, but also use of more highly efficient appliances. Of the other indicators in the building sector, which we cannot classify directly, it is still very clear that substantial improvements are needed. So we are looking at the carbon intensity of operations in both residential and commercial buildings, which both would need to more than halve by 2030. And then the deep retrofitting rate of buildings is currently less than 1% per year, and that would need to increase to 2.5% to 3.5% per year. Industry is the system where greenhouse gas emissions have risen the most over the past 2 decades. Globally, this is mainly due to the increase for demand of industrial products, which again is driven by increasing rates of prosperity and also urbanization and infrastructure development. There are, however, also here some bright spots. So, for example, the growth of the share of electricity in the industry sector's final energy demand is almost on track. It would only need to increase 1.7 timefold to reach the 35% by 2030. Other subsectors look less promising right now. We mainly take a look here at cement and steel because both of them, they together are responsible for more than 50% of direct greenhouse gas emissions in the industry sector. So decarbonizing them will have a huge impact. Carbon emitted per ton of cement produced would need to increase more than tenfold to be on track. And this can be done by switching to alternative fuels, using more novel cements, reducing demand, and also implementing carbon capture and storage. Related to that, carbon emissions per ton of steel produced are actually even going into the wrong direction altogether, meaning that to get back on track, a lot needs to happen, including recycling of scrap steel, using of green hydrogen as a fuel, iron ore electrolysis, and also deployment of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. There are, however, we try to dig a bit deeper to see if there's some momentum for positive change that can already be seen. And here we actually saw that although, as we just saw, the carbon intensity of steel is going the wrong direction, there are advancements with over 30 projects being planned by 2030 of low carbon steel. Most of them are based on hydrogen based production. And but even though we can see that additional investment and also policy supports are needed, regulations as well to improve these technologies and bring down costs for both steel and green hydrogen. The transport sector is probably one that we can witness the most promising developments over the past years, most prominently the rapidly increase of sales of electric vehicles, which is the first graph you can see here. Sales have doubled between 20 to 21, up to 9%. And in 2022, they did another jump to reach 14%, actually. Also here, although it is off track, we expect exponential non-linear increase because it is directly linked to technological uptake. Similarly, the share of bus sales is also very promising, with now almost 1 in 2 buses sold being electric. However, there's also a lot of other indicators which are lagging behind. First of all, we look at the light-duty vehicle fleet. So although the sales are increasing rapidly, until there's the whole stock turnover of the fleet, it takes time, so this is lagging behind. And currently only around 2% of all vehicles on the road have an electric drivetrain. We also looked at other modes of transport where a change in drivetrain or fuel could lead to decarbonization, mainly medium and heavy-duty vehicles, which are well off track, and also shipping and aviation. Situation for shipping and aviation is slightly different because unlike the other transport modes, the technologies are more novel and not yet readily available. Hence, substantive investment in research, development, and also deployment is needed. We also looked at a couple of modal shift indicators where we look how infrastructure needs to be built to allow for these alternate modes. In this case, we have the rapid transit network and also a number of bike lanes. For both of those, acceleration needs to increase fast, 6-fold for rapid transit networks and 10-fold for the bike lanes, more than 10-fold for the bike lanes. So how do we establish the conditions to bring all of these indicators and shifts back on track, or not back on track, but on track? So for transport and industry sector, where we have novel technologies that still need to be developed, we need increased R&D investment and also building the complementary infrastructure for decarbonization. But also for existing zero and low carbon technology, a lot of more investments is needed as well as technology transfer. Across all sectors, energy and fuel efficiency regulations and standards need to be adapted. And we need to not only incentivize the uptake of zero and low carbon technology, but also reverse the policies that currently incentivize emission-intensive development. And of course, public finance for decarbonization must be scaled up. In order to make sure that these regulations are also enforced, we need to strengthen institutional capacity. And last but not least, decarbonization roadmaps and also specific sectoral targets have shown to lead to positive results. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Sophie, who will take you through some other sectors, systems.
Thanks so much, Judit. So in addition to decarbonizing these energy systems, limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius will also require transformational change across agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, a system that accounted for just over a fifth of global greenhouse gases in 2019. So in transforming this system, it's critical that we address 3 challenges. First, we must tackle food insecurity and hunger, ensuring that we produce enough nutritious food for nearly 10 billion people in 2050. Second, we must increase yields in the face of intensifying climate impacts and without expanding agricultural production onto ecosystems. This is particularly important for forests, peatlands, coastal wetlands, and grasslands. And ideally, these gains in productivity will not only help reduce greenhouse gas emissions from land use change, but also free up some agricultural lands for reforestation and restoration. And third, we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural production itself. And it's especially critical that we address these challenges in ways that safeguard nature, protecting soil, water, and biodiversity. So for the Systems Change Lab and our State of Climate Action reports, we translate these big system-wide transformations into a more manageable set of discrete shifts, which you can see here. And taken together, these shifts can help deliver the changes needed to avoid increasingly dangerous climate impacts. So here you can see that for Afolu specifically, these include supply-side shifts in agricultural production to sustainably increase yields across crop, livestock, and aquaculture systems, as well as demand-side shifts in reducing food loss and waste and consumption of ruminant meat to help avoid greenhouse gas emissions from land use change and production. Protecting, restoring, and sustainably managing the world's ecosystems, again, particularly forests, peatlands, coastal wetlands, and grasslands, can also yield multiple benefits for the climate. So these include preventing the release of their large carbon stores into the atmosphere, protecting their ability to continue sequestering carbon, and for tropical forests in particular, maintaining biophysical mechanisms that help cool the planet. And as Claire mentioned, we identify 1.5C aligned targets and indicators to track progress wherever possible. But as you'll see on the next slide, we don't yet have targets and indicators for sustainable management and some coastal wetlands, and this is largely due to data limitations. So I just want to acknowledge that our assessment of progress is not yet as comprehensive as we would like it to be. And similarly, you'll note that we only are focusing here on shifts that are important to climate mitigation. But under the Systems Change Lab, we're working on building out a broader list of shifts that also speak to the direct drivers of biodiversity loss, such as the spread of invasive species or other forms of pollution. But with that said, over this decade, we still need to dramatically reduce deforestation and mangrove losses, as well as effectively halt peatland degradation by 2030. But as you can see here, recent efforts to slow deforestation to just 1.9 million hectares per year remain well off track. From 2015 to 2021, deforestation occurred across an area roughly the size of Iraq, emitting a total of 25 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And nearly half of these losses happened in humid tropical primary forests, which are among some of the world's most important lands for carbon storage and biodiversity. So worse still, global mangrove losses are once again ticking upwards, such that a step change in action is now needed. And in addition to avoiding these ecosystem losses, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will also require large-scale restoration across 300 million hectares of deforested lands and 20 million hectares of degraded peatlands by 2050, as well as restoring 240,000 hectares of mangroves by 2030. And here too, you can see that recent progress made toward near-term targets are largely inadequate. And getting on track for a 1.5 degree pathway would, for example, require the world to reforest an area roughly the size of South Korea each year through 2030, which is about 1.5 times faster than recent rates of change. Next slide, please. So achieving these targets for forests, peatlands, and mangroves in large part will depend on our ability to change how we produce and consume food. And this is by no means a small task. So although the emissions intensity of agricultural production is declining, total greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural production continue to rise, increasing by about 0.6% annually. But getting on track for 2030 will require us to change course entirely, with total emissions from agricultural production declining by about 22% relative to 2017. And while recent efforts to boost productivity are heading in the right direction, they remain well off track for crop yields and off track for ruminant meat productivity. And then finally, on the demand side shifts, data are inefficient to assess progress made in halving food loss and waste by 2030. But we do know that efforts to reduce consumption of ruminant meat, like beef and lamb, remain well off track in high-consuming countries. And I just want to emphasize here that this target only applies to high-consuming regions and is not global in scope. Next slide. So fortunately, we've seen a wave of recent commitments that suggests that the tide may be beginning to turn, and we may soon begin to see more progress made towards these targets. But I think it's also critical to remember that efforts to translate past pledges into action have often fallen short. And this is because, in large part, there are a range of barriers that have proven quite difficult to overcome. So, for example, many of the innovations needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural production and boost yields in a changing climate are relatively nascent. While good practices do exist around the world, more RD&D support is often needed to scale them to new sociopolitical and environmental contexts. At the same time, weak or conflicting policies, limited institutional capacity, complex land tenure regimes, and misaligned and insufficient finance make it really difficult to slow deforestation and degradation. And on the demand side, shifting social norms and changing behaviors around reducing food loss and waste and shifting diets remains challenging. This is a relatively new field, and we're still learning which interventions are effective over the long term. So here we present a range of enabling conditions that taken together can help overcome some of these challenges and spur transformational change across this system. Next slide, please. And so here we briefly zoom into what we think is one specific bright spot. Indonesia in particular represents an example of different enabling conditions coming together to enable positive change. So as you can see here, declines in humid tropical primary forest loss followed devastating fires that occurred across Indonesia in 2015 and 2016. And in the aftermath of these fires, the Indonesian government implemented a portfolio of actions from issuing a moratorium on new developments in forests and peatlands to passing social reforms to encourage more sustainable land management. And together, these actions have helped reduce these rates of loss since 2017. And so on that positive note, I will give it back to Claire to walk us through finance.
Great, thank you. So I think you'll have seen from all of these systems that finance is a critical transformation underpinning everything else. And until we have the money going in the right places, we're not going to be moving fast enough. What we need to see in terms of a roadmap for finance, of course, we need to see the green economy growing. That means more public and private finance going towards climate, of course, climate mitigation, but also adaptation and loss and damage. And as that green economy grows, we need to stop further capital investment in fossil fuels, and existing assets need to be wound down, and the financing for those needs to dry up. We also need to make sure that the green economy is just and equitable, so that those groups that have been marginalized or not served by the high carbon economy can benefit from this shift. And unfortunately, although I think these changes are very clear, it's very well understood what needs to happen, action still lags far behind rhetoric. And I think we see in the next slide, this I find actually personally the most alarming finding of our analysis is that all of the finance indicators that we track in the State of Climate Action Report are not just off track, but well off track, meaning that they have to speed up by 5 times or even more than 10 times in many cases. So for example, in the top left there, you can see that we need to increase global climate finance flows up to around 5 trillion per year. by 2030. We have seen over the past decade or so about a doubling, and I think estimates for 2021, the most recent estimates that the Climate Policy Initiative has put out are for around 0.8 to 0.9 trillion, but that's still quite a long way off of that target. Another example in the bottom left, we can see that more and more governments are mandating the disclosure of climate data when making climate investment decisions or investment decisions in general, but still a very, very small percentage of global emissions are in jurisdictions with such mandates. And then coming over to the far right-hand side at the bottom, of course, we can see we're still spending hundreds of billions of dollars on fossil fuel subsidies. Of course, these should be redirected to the low-carbon, zero-carbon economy. The next slide, in the interest of time, I won't go through this in detail, but it's clear that we need to make sure that the global capital that is there is sufficient capital to make this transition. And I think we learned from the COVID pandemic that we can mobilize very quickly and we can move very large sums of money when we really want to. And it's a finding of the IPCC that there is sufficient global capital to make this shift, but we need to stop the misalignment. We need to make sure that countries have enough fiscal space to make the transitions they need. This needs to happen equitably. We need to build up institutional capacities, reduce vested interests and the ability of vested interests to involve themselves in government decisions. And we need to see, of course, stronger climate targets coming forward as well. But I'll keep that short in the interest of time, just to go back to this overall finding to remind us across all of these systems. I think one of the values of this work is it really sets a very clear roadmap for what's needed for 1.5 across these different systems with clear targets that are science-based, showing what can and should happen in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And what's I think also really valuable if you go and explore the platform and the report is you can see where we are off track, where we are moving but still not fast enough, and what those critical enablers are that can help pull the right levers and make sure we close the emissions gap. I'll pass back to Louise.
Thanks, Claire and Judit and Sophie for sharing those insights. A wealth of information there, and I'm aware of the work that goes into it. But I think it's also important to then think even more about how concretely the Global Stocktake can help us use that information and take it forward. And for that, I'd like to hand over to Lukas, Hermwille and Sebastian Oberthür. Just a brief introduction. Lukas is a senior researcher at the Wuppertal Institute and has really led and contributed to multiple papers and analyses on the Global Stocktake, so great to have you with us. And Sebastian's director of the Research Centre for Environment, Economy and Energy, and also a professor at the Brussels School of Governance. Thank you both for joining us today. I will hand it over to you to walk us through your recent research.
Thanks very much, and I'll make a start by introducing a little bit the work of the NDC Aspects project on enhancing international cooperation through the Global Stocktake. So we are now zooming in on international cooperation. The NDC Aspects project overall is obviously much broader, but it has also in common across its different elements a focus on 4 sectors: systems, social systems, I don't know. This process is excellent at burning terms, so we'll use sectoral systems for the time being. And those are energy-intensive industries, buildings, land transport, and afuru. Next slide, please. So first on our approach, as I just mentioned, sectoral systems as a central unit of analysis, and it's perhaps important to understand that we try to focus on speaking to communities of action that are out there. So these are social technical systems, which is not the same as economic or emission sectors. But that just as a side note. Our approach to analyzing international cooperation is first that we, for these different sectoral systems, identify the challenges of and barriers to the decarbonization that exist. And the next step would be No, thanks, still staying on that one for a moment. Comparing the potential contribution that international cooperation, that international institutions could make with what they actually contribute so far. And that allows us then to identify remaining gaps and underexploited opportunities and potentials, which again provides the basis for thinking about how to fill these gaps and more fully exploit these potentials. And we do this by always asking, could existing institutions deliver more, or do we need new institutions, or actually both of this? And dividing up the whole into units that are meaningful for actor behavior and policymaking is the overall approach. Next slide then, please. For analyzing the contribution of international cooperation, international institutions, we distinguish 6 functions that international institutions in general can deliver. And I'm not going into detail, just reading from the top to the bottom: guidance and signal they can provide. They can reach agreement on rules and standards, provide for more transparency and accountability, make available means of implementation, the different aspects of that, provide a platform for knowledge and learning. And perhaps importantly, as you will see also in the different sectoral systems, there are lots of institutions around. So increasingly important is to how to orchestrate the different institutions that are already out there so that they create a consistent, coherent whole and contribute to the maximum. Next slide then. We go to energy-intensive industries, and just to illustrate our approach, that one will be a little bit more elaborate, and then we'll go more briefly into the other sectoral systems. Next slide, please. So first, we were mapping kind of what's out there in the world, and you see from at the top, there are intergovernmental institutions and initiatives. There are hybrid ones where states and non-state actors cooperate, and there are transnational, non-state actor-led initiatives and institutions at the bottom. We also have more institutionalized international arrangements, which we here call international institutions, and the more white ones are more loosely institutionalized international initiatives. And what we have also seen in this area is a constant growth of these initiatives and institutions, which is not really represented here a lot. You see up there at the top that there is the Climate Club idea, which is being set up, and the EU-US Carbon-Based Sectoral Agreement initiative, which is also in the making. But overall, we have done this analysis over a number of years. And the landscape has grown, especially over the past 5 years, tremendously, and it is still growing. So that's the first step, mapping. Next slide, please. And then we go through the functions that international institutions can deliver, see what the existing supply is and what the remaining gaps may be. And we identify gaps still nearly for all of the functions, but we highlight a number of them. So signal guidance we have there. Perhaps an authoritative vision for specific objective for energy-intensive industries is not really there, but may also not be that necessary because these are strategic actors who very much are aware of where the world is going. So we identify, that is in bold, particular needs in the areas of rules and standards, where we have lots of near zero greenhouse gas basic material standards, but not a harmonization of those standards. Also, there is a need to further enhance international lead markets, and there are no rules currently on competition and carbon leakage. And then in the area of means of implementation, we need very much an increase of finance for technology development and financing technology deployment and diffusion. And as I said before, given the growth of international institutions and initiatives in this area, orchestration of the bigger picture of making a whole, coherent whole out of all these pieces is increasingly important as in a task that needs to be fulfilled still. I'm not going through the things that are not in bold, but if you have questions about them, we can come back later why they're not in bold. So which leads us to our recommendations. As I said, we're looking at existing institutions, also what's newly emerging or may need to be created. And we're always looking at what is the feasibility, what is the capacity of existing institutions, what's their membership, can they really fulfill these tasks. And our first point is there are lots of existing institutions that are addressing the gaps already, and we can make more effective use of them by scaling up the means of implementation and international lead market initiatives that are already out there, by harmonizing standards across initiatives with overlapping membership, and by organizing high-level review and orchestration of the sectoral landscape. So these are the things that can be done with the institutions that are out there and that are emerging. And we pay particular attention to the proposed now emerging Climate Club, the initiative of the G7. But we think then need to be a few tweaks to it to address shortcomings on membership, legitimacy, and political feasibility. The club's membership needs to be broadened beyond the G7 very clearly. That will require clear commitments on finance, privileged access to lead markets, and proactive consideration of equity issues to reach really beyond the G7 and reach the main countries that one needs to have there. And then the Climate Club obviously needs to and also synergize with all the other agendas and institutions and initiatives that are out there, and itself can contribute to that. If that's achieved, it can actually make a difference can contribute to all the things that are also indicated at the top of the slide. One word on carbon leakage and how to address that. In our analysis at the moment, there's limited potential for international cooperation in this, given the current geopolitical context. And in our assessment, therefore, a focus on addressing other gaps seems to be sensible in the short to medium term, without obviously forgetting about the issue of carbon leakage and that it may need to be addressed. But doing that in a international context at the moment seems tricky. And with that, I would hand over to Lukas.
Thanks. I will be a bit quicker and with less detail in the remaining three sectors for two reasons. Because first, I did not do the research myself, and second, because we have learned about the approach in general before that. But let's go into the buildings work, please. Okay, so here you see kind of the map for the building sector. I think the main gist is that there are fewer organizations, also a lot of initiatives, but none really central organizations that could lead to that. Next slide, please. In the analysis, we see that we still do not have an authoritative vision with official government support about decarbonizing building heating and cooling, for example. I think that's something that we are seeing in Germany right now, where there's a massive political battle over the transformation of the heating sector. I think a global signal would have streamlined this discussion, maybe, hopefully. We also lack transparency. We've heard that in your presentation earlier from the System Change Lab as well, that you had a hard time finding the right indicators, and that's also true for the means of implementation. Next slide, please. So in terms of strengthening the environment, the international cooperation, a good starting point would be the buildings breakthrough that was adopted last year in Sharm el-Sheikh. We were kind of a bit torn between having a new institution or not, but most experts interviewed rather said, let's use the existing initiatives, and the breakthrough was the most obvious one, and it should provide clearer objectives, guidance, and signal to phase out fossil heating, adopt coordinated commitments to decarbonize building stock and procure only high-efficient equipment and appliances in buildings, especially put greater emphasis on the transparency and accountability front to improve that data availability issues, and scale up support for policy development, planning, implementation, evaluation, enforcement capacity in the building sector. Next slide, please. In the land transport sector, again, next, we have a different picture. There are even more institutions, existing institutions, new institutions coming up. A lot of them focused on relatively narrow fields. Next slide, please. And in terms of the gaps, we lack also an authoritative and centralized roadmap for government-backed net zero targets. In general, there is a lack of concrete international rules, especially, for example, with respect to phasing out internal combustion engine fossil-fueled cars. Reporting requirements pay little attention to the sectors. There is still support for high-emission transports being provided, and generally we lack orchestration and coordination of all those institutions that you saw on the map previously. Next slide, please. To enhance this, we propose that we should collectively work on a more authoritative transport-specific roadmap. One idea would be to start maybe with a mitigation work program here, and build on existing work also from the Climate Champions global action pathways, to integrate sector-specific emission budgets in NDCs, and maybe work towards a climate club focused on electric mobility. Obviously, that is something about coordinating phase-out dates and phase-out pathways for ICE vehicles, but it could also entail kind of a distributive issues. For example, colleagues from South Africa that are part of the NDC Aspects Consortium, they have seen that South Africa, the automotive industry, is the most important export-oriented industry of the country, but so far the electric vehicle developments largely bypass it, so they are really afraid of losing that industrial part, and there is also scope for negotiating these kind of changes that might occur in the transformation. And in terms of transparency and accountability, we would really call for additional reporting requirements under the enhanced transparency framework once that's being revised. Next slide. On agriculture, forestry, and land use, we have an even more messy map. Here, I think the main reason for that is that there are so many more issues surrounding it than just climate. It's about livelihoods, it's about forestry, it's about agriculture. I can't go into this, but it's a really a fascinating thing to look at for hours. Next slide, please. So I think, again, we lack transparency, we lack high-level data. I'll probably just go to the recommendations. Next slide, please. Because overall, we need orchestration and alignment to coordinate this mess, in a sense, and bring the communities together to enhance and align with the UNFCCC rules and modalities, a common framework, and make more inclusive those international governance initiatives that many of which are oriented to just a very specific set of stakeholders, strengthen the application of internationally agreed rules and modalities, and enhance also the transparency and accountability. With respect to the needs of means of implementation, there's a need to mobilize appropriate blended finance and catalyze necessary transformations in the sector. We need loans, grants, on top of the results-based payments that are currently dominating the field, I guess, and make sure that we increase the efficiency in which the resources are used. Next slide, please. And now I can pace down a little bit and focus more on the specific recommendations that we developed for this process, for the Global Stocktake. And just as kind of an announcement, we are about to publish a paper, a comment tonight in the journal POLS Climate, which basically entails those recommendations in more detail. Next slide, please. So for the Global Stocktake, we would want to see that in the political phase, the Global Stocktake calls to include sectoral breakdowns of targets and specific sectoral policies in the NDCs and low emission development strategies. The Global Stocktake might call for an update of the modalities, MPGs, modalities, procedures and guidelines of the enhanced transparency framework, maybe even ahead of the 28 timeline that we have already adopted, and the focus of those revisions should enable us more systematic reporting of sectoral transformation challenges and opportunities, because that is something that we currently see that countries are not systematically doing and are also not systematically asked to do in the current system. We also ask that the Global Stocktake should call to strengthen accountability mechanisms, for example, through leveraging the annual high-level ministerial roundtable on pre-2030 ambition as an accountability checkpoint for sectoral commitments that parties may have made within this process, but also outside initiatives, and establish or mandate sectoral decarbonization roadmaps, building on existing work, including the climate action pathways, and maybe also working with the mitigation work program. So ideally, we would already get those roadmaps from the Global Stocktake, but if that's not the case, then the GST could, for example, call on more central sectoral institutions to develop those to collaborate and develop those decarbonization roadmaps that might then be endorsed or taken note of at later COPs. And outside the UNFCCC system, we would suggest that globally we broaden and deepen the various minilateral initiatives that we have identified throughout those sectors, including the Climate Club and the Glasgow Breakthroughs. For those, I think the most important point is to really specify a more clear follow-up process. So far, well, most of them were really invented very recently. The question is whether they will be sustained and deeper institutionalized, and for that we need a follow-up process, and we also need a review process to really see whether they can deliver on what they have promised to do. And I think to link those systems back together, it would be really excellent if countries could more systematically include those sectoral commitments and announcements they have made in the context of breakthroughs and all those initiatives, but include them also in the NDC so that they will become part of the transparency arrangements of the Paris Agreement. And yeah, as I said, the Global Stocktake should also call on other sectoral international organizations to align their activities with the Paris Agreement. This is particularly relevant, I guess, for the IMO and ICAO, which do something on climate, but that's clearly not enough. Another key point of synergies will be the ongoing negotiations on a global plastics pollution treaty, which will have tremendous potential synergies with respect to advancing decarbonization for the plastics industry. And the last slide, I guess, is the NDC Aspects Consortium. And the very last, I think we'll hopefully make it also available to you, is kind of a list of where you can read up on all of our work. We have various submissions, all those for reports that we were presented, and our comment that will appear later today. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, both of you, for those insights. We now need a bit of a cast change up at the front here, so if you guys would mind taking some seats in the front row. And I'd like to invite Josephine Dua from Denmark and Felipe Castiblanco to join me to give a bit of a response and some reflections from a negotiations perspective on how we can implement this systems change. Thank you both for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time from your schedules to do that. Just so the audience knows who we're speaking to, Josephine is a special advisor in the Center for Global Climate Action and the International Office with the Danish Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities. And Felipe Castiblanco, I believe, works in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Colombia and is a negotiator here. Thank you again both for joining us. Josephine, if I can turn to you first, I'd just like to ask you to share a bit of your reflections on the presentations you've just heard, and maybe reflect on what are some of the things that negotiators could take with them into the final phases of the Global Stocktake over the coming months. What can we build on? What can we utilize in that process?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for the presentations. I think they were very useful, and it's a very relevant input to the Global Stocktake, and especially also to this technical dialogue that we are in right now, and that will be ongoing here in Bonn. So I think, first of all, I think it's important that to just reflect on that for Global Stocktake to actually be a success and create real action on the ground. First of all, we have to acknowledge that there is an ambition gap right now. If we want to reach a max temperature of 1.5 degree temperature rise. And then second of all, I think it's definitely important that we start talking about implementations, and this is where this systems transformations and sectoral approaches makes really good sense. But it is also a new thing to talk about it in the UN climate negotiations. It's a new thing that we're starting to pinpoint these high-emitting sectors and pinpointing that they're part of the problem and need to transition. So, but it's also about time, and it's very important because, as the presentations shown, we are very much off track on globally on a lot of these. So I think it's a very important discussion to have now, especially because we need to start collectively signal to all levels of society, being local governments and businesses and NGOs and governments in general, that we need to send collective signals now that it's time to take action. And I just would like to just offer a little reflection of actually, from a Danish perspective, how we've gone around this same subject, but from a domestic point of view. Because in Denmark, we set a target back in 2020 of a 70% reduction target by 2030. And this is kind of then you have the ambition, right? And then next up was the implementation phase. And it's set in the Climate Act that the government needs to yearly present a climate program. And the government has then chosen to take a sectoral approach to this. And actually presenting every year kind of a roadmap with what are the initiatives and agreements that we've already done on all these sectors, so being energy, agriculture, industry, buildings, and so on, and then looking at so what have we done already, what is gonna be up next. So concretely, actually, this is a roadmap way of doing it, where the government, based on analysis of reduction potentials in the different sectors, are looking at how far have we come and where do we need to go. And this is actually also basically, so for example, in the energy sector, they would be presenting we made this agreement on renewable energy targets, we made this agreement on energy efficiency targets, and we want to do this strategy on hydrogen this year, and we want to revisit the agreement on renewable energy this year, and we want to make regulation this and then, and the same goes for EU policies. So laying out and being very transparent in what are we as a government going to be doing. And I think this is a good way of inviting in rest of society and being in the plans for the sectors. And I think this is very much what is necessary at a global scale, also at a global level. I know it can be hard to do it at the same level as a domestic, but still giving these signals and giving some clarity for all levels of society, so that so it's more predictable for companies and for local governments what they're looking into. so yeah, I think that's what I would like to say.
Thanks very much. I would be very curious if you already have some success stories coming out of Denmark by using these roadmaps, or is it too early in the process to tell that?
No, I think I'm not a technical expert on this, but no, I definitely think has given clarity to especially to companies and the municipalities as well. And I think what the government also did actually was go into partnerships with the companies and asking them what do you need to see from us in this transition. They very much then came out, these groups of companies went together with government and kind of presented their recommendations that the government could then take into the climate plans and also accommodating them in that way.
Yeah, so really facilitating a collaborative process. Thanks very much. Felipe, can I pose a similar question to you? It would be interesting to hear your insights again on the opportunities and the challenges of taking a systems perspective, and maybe then again further, how can the Global Stocktake process here be picking that perspective up and utilizing it?
Thank you very much. And let me start by, of course, appreciating the invitation to be here today and share some of the reflections. Start probably by saying that Colombia itself sees great value on this type of research that is trying to actually give us a bit of more clarity on what we mean when we're talking about system transformations or international cooperation. There is a lot of anxiety in the negotiation rooms when it comes to understanding more clearly what we want to see under the global stocktake of maybe having something more operationalized inside the decisions. We know that in the negotiations room, sometimes we become very technical, and that's a real challenge when we want to see something more clear, especially in terms of any type of sectorial approach. And in that sense, Colombia has been trying to really put a lot of effort and being very vocal about the global stocktake as a really, really important mechanism that can bring us probably much more clarity, not only to parties, but also to non-state actors on what exactly we want to see on the next step, especially during this decade. That means probably talking more about metrics, talking more about quantitative detailed information. What exactly can we probably look at indicators that can actually follow the discussion more clearly to all sectors. So in that sense, I think that I value a lot the work has been presented, and I mean, this comes, of course, by saying that the GST definitely should start by thinking ahead on what is going to be this way forward, because we know that that's going to be the most probably sensible aspect on the negotiations, and it's important that we can be very clear as a way to also understand the effectiveness of the Paris Agreement in all the broad sense. But it gives us an opportunity to think much more about our NDCs. We want to see that guidance. We want to see what exactly can we see on an NDC that it cannot be only, I mean, NDCs as we see it might sometimes feel a very empty box with nothing very clear to many parties, and we don't want to see that. We want to see that the next round of NDCs can be very clear on metrics, on understanding much better what are the commitments that countries are doing, so we can really understand and commit to the Paris Agreement goals. So in that sense, I was chair, for example, Colombia's NDC is set a goal 2 years ago of reducing emissions to 51%. And one of the biggest challenge we had is we in our NDCs, which is, it was a big challenge, but we managed to have all our sectorials included. And in a way, we came with more than 200 indicators to trying to push for that, which is understanding a really difficult technical process when it comes to talking to all the sectors of the government. But it's a process, and I think we are very, at least glad that this is advancing in a more implementation road. So this type of of research really, I think, is a great value on input on how we're going to understand specifically the discussion on system transformations. Of course, as ILAC Group, we are also trying to put a decision or trying to look into a decision that is going to be very clear on system transformation narratives. We know that this is what the IPCC is saying, and we also know that this is what needs to guide the discussions when it comes to actually looking ahead, not staying probably in the same type of narrative we already had. And by that, I also really like the approach on the research that you're not only looking on what exactly means scaling up capacity or other means of implementation on NDCs, but also long-term strategies. Because this is not only about NDCs, it needs to be also aligned with many countries who have not already established any type of long-term strategies. And it's something that it probably maybe need more guidance and much more capacity building on that sense for countries. And of course, I would probably end by saying that under the GST, there's also a big opportunity to have a much more clear narrative on what exactly are those initiatives that are happening internationally. And those type of collaboration, especially for the Global South, are essential if we want to commit to any type of Paris Agreement in the long run. So I do feel that there's a good expectations in terms of looking ahead on what are those concrete practices, has been mentioned in the report, that countries can really look forward. I mean, there's already voices on the negotiation rooms of trying to find those initiatives globally. Let's say there's been really good positive comments about the methane, the commitment on methane, which at least as a practice itself has been very put forward and has a lot of positives towards ahead. So I feel that this could be something to think forward. But with that, I would probably end by saying that, as my colleague from Danish said, without being an expert, there's this anxiety that we can actually have a global stocktake that can signal action and can be very operational on whatever we want to include that. So my invitation to you, of course, is to really, really make us think harder on what are those, how we can translate something that we can see more clearly in terms of not even recommendations, but even more ahead. What are those targets we want to set to 2030? What are those things that can actually set us forward to be much more ambitious until we have the next round of NDCs? Thank you.
Thank you. I think those words say it perfectly, and that is certainly our goal, to help you to achieve those goals. And great to hear that the work so far has been useful. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I'd just like to invite the audience here in case there are any burning questions, either to our speakers already here or the presenters who you heard from earlier. Anybody in the audience have a question? Or also online, I believe we also have some participants joining us online. Yes, please. Sorry, do we have any microphones? Otherwise, please speak up and I can repeat if needed. We have a microphone here for you. Thank you.
Oh, hi, Nathan. Yeah, just questions for the first two ladies who spoke. One used the word ending unabated fossil fuels. Why was the word unabated mentioned in there? And the second speaker talked about CCS and CCUS and green hydrogen. Is this drawn from any evidence of this really happening anywhere at an economic scale without being too costly? Any evidence of working examples?
Claire, would you be willing to start a response on that one?
Yes. Hi. Yeah, good question. So in my presentation, I was speaking specifically about the power sector, and there we see really very limited, basically no role for CCS based on our analysis, considering that, for example, there are low-cost renewable options that would make much more economic sense than using CCS, and there are basically no good examples of CCS being applied in the power sector. But we use the terminology unabated coal and gas in this context because the analysis is based on coal and gas plants that don't have CCS units applied to them, there being basically none at the moment. But I think you can essentially translate it to all coal and gas when thinking about the power sector. But maybe, Judit, shall I pass over to you for the...
Yeah, and regarding the industry ones, I mean, yeah, like Claire said, we try not to emphasize CCS and CCUS too much in other sectors, but for the industry sector, it's just the fact that especially for the process emissions, it's currently we don't have other solutions of how to replace them and how to completely go to zero emissions. So we see CCS and CCUS as part of the solution. Although, yeah, like you said, it's currently not on scale and we're not there yet. That's why we need all of these investments needed in the RD&D.
Thanks, Judit. I think we have time for just one more question, and I see a hand raised there.
Hi, I have another question for both of you. I am Johnny Stengel, a Fridays for Future Germany activist, but I am also a student at South University of London, where I'm writing a paper right now about the importance of the energy sector in the global south versus global north. So my question would be, do you have any input should we focus on the G20 energy sector, or do you have any papers that you can recommend?
Yeah, so this analysis that we did was really at global level, obviously acknowledging that different countries and different regions have different circumstances and will move at different paces. I would say all countries need to look at how to decarbonize their energy system and also how to accelerate access. And of course, with these co-benefits for air pollution, water use and things like that, there's really no argument to not go with that transition. We do have the Climate Action Tracker has been developing some benchmarks at the national level for a small number of countries. At Climate Analytics, we also have our 1.5 National Pathway Explorer, which looks at about 60 countries and the energy transition, that it would be 1.5 compatible. So yeah, a few resources for you to check out there. And anyone else like to come in?
Do you want to add in? Unfortunately, we are somewhat out of time and I'm under obligation to clear the room for the next side event, but I would really like to thank you all very much for joining us today. I'm sure the speakers and also our panelists would be happy to hear any further questions that you have. And just to encourage you to please do check out, for example, our Systems Change Lab website and the NDC Aspects work. That paper from Lukas is coming out tonight, and I hope there's even more information in there that you will find interesting and useful to your needs. So thanks again, and I wish you a productive and useful time in Bonn.